All right, this is the second video lecture for Allegory of the Cave. And we're going to start first with a chart of the symbols in the allegory and what they symbolize. So first we have just the cave prisoners, right? And they, of course, symbolize human beings. More specifically, you have the prisoner's body, which represents the soul or mind of a human being. And then even more specifically, you have what the prisoners are doing with their body throughout the allegory, right? Which is they're perceiving and seeing, which represents the mind thinking or believing or knowing. Then we have objects of perception, right? Things seen throughout the allegory. And objects of perception are always representing objects of knowledge. So the first central object of perception in the allegory are the shadows. So what do the shadows represent? Well, they represent what we think, what we believe, or what we know. In other words, they represent passively accepted or passively inherited beliefs. We also have the sculptures that the puppeteers are carrying, and really the kind of sculptures that our freed prisoner is unable to look at or identify. And the sculptures here represent arguments that challenge our simplistic beliefs, right? Especially at that moment when the prisoner is escorted towards the fire and he can't see the sculptures and they cause him pain because he can't see them or make them out from the glow of the fire. Now, when we refer to objects of perception, right, again, we mean the thing which is being perceived. So we can think about it in terms of grammar, right? When I perceive the laptop, I am the subject of perception, the thing that's doing the seeing. And the laptop is the object of perception, right, the thing being seen. And so similarly, the object of knowledge is the thing that is being known. In other words, the thing that's being apprehended or understood by the knower. Okay, now the prisoner gradually adjusts to the light in the upper world. And this symbolizes the gradual process of intellectual growth. All right, as the prisoner's sight develops, he can perceive more complex objects. But it takes time for his sight to progress from one category of thing to the next category of thing. And so we can consider the different stages of perception that he moves through once he's outside the cave, right? First, he can only look at shadows. And then he can look at reflections of things in the water. Then he can perceive things themselves. Next, he can gaze at the night sky. And lastly, he can look upon the sun itself. And each stage of perception includes more complex and detailed objects than the previous stage, right? There's more stuff to investigate, like the addition of color or the addition of clarity when he's looking at three-dimensional real objects as opposed to black and white shadows or even reflections of things in the water. And so it takes the freed prisoner a much longer time to investigate all the aspects and the detail and the complexity of a tree than it would take him to investigate the aspects of the shadow of the tree. And so we want to think symbolically, right? What's going on here? What might each visual stage of perception represent? And so moving through these stages represents the intellect progressing from simplistic to complex ideas or theories or worldviews. And so, for instance, say that you've grown up passively accepting as true the very simplistic belief that capitalism is good and socialism equals bad. But even though you've kind of grown up accepting this is true, one day you say to yourself, but I've never really read or studied any economic theory or economic history or political philosophy. And so you decide, all right, I'm going to get educated on the nature and essence of capitalism and socialism. Now imagine that you begin this intellectual journey by picking up a copy of Karl Marx's Capital or Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations or any other dense theoretical work on economic and political theory. I mean, if you start off the bat with this stuff, you're going to be totally lost and confused. It's going to be like trying to decipher ancient Greek. So if you want to begin thinking and studying about the complicated matters of politics and economic theory, you have to begin at an introductory level with the basics and then gradually progress to the more advanced materials. Right? Intellectual growth and development is a gradual process. It's arduous and it's confusing and it takes time. And this process is what's symbolized in Plato's Allegory by the gradual process of the freed prisoner moving from one type of visual object to the next, right? From shadows to reflections of things in the water, to things themselves, to the night sky, and so on and so forth. So consider our example again about political and economic theory. What's the very first place that you might want to begin? What's a good starting place that's sort of like how the prisoner started his journey by looking at shadows? And, it's probably going to be something like dictionary definitions, right? The dictionary definition of capitalism, an economic system based on the private ownership over the means of production. The dictionary definition of socialism, right? An economic system based on the social or public ownership of the means of production, right? And so this is like a really fine place to start. These are more or less very correct definitions of socialism and capitalism. But they're just one sentence explanations, right? There's not much detail or information there to process. So it's sort of like a shadow, a representation, a simplistic representation of a complex idea without much detail. But it's not a passively accepted knowledge because you were actively seeking out this information, actively engaging in a process of learning. All right, so where might you move next on this intellectual journey? What kind of basic knowledge would be symbolized by moving from shadows to reflections of things in the water? Okay, you say to yourself, I've read the definitions. Now let me spend 3 hours on Wikipedia or SparkNotes reading about capitalism as a theory, or as an economic arrangement, and socialism as a political and economic arrangement, right? There's tons and tons of more detail and data and information to process. But again, it's mostly digestible summaries. And so definitions, encyclopedia entries, and summaries, these are all introductions to topics which allow you to build up your intellectual foundations. Next, on your sort of intellectual journey here, right, you might finally dive into the theoretical works themselves, right? Like the things themselves, as opposed to the shadows and the reflections. And you can spend months and months or years of your life studying or taking a class on the topic or the book from trained experts. So that kind of represents the intellectual stages of development and progression, which is symbolized in the allegory as the prisoner adjusts to light outside the cave by moving from looking at shadows to reflections to things and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's return back to our kind of chart of symbols here and what they symbolize. We have the sun in the allegory, right? Now, the sun is the source of light, and this light allows the eyes to perceive. Now, it gets really kind of heady here, but what the sun represents is the nature of being or existence itself. And existence itself is the source of reality and therefore truth, right? The existence of truth allows the mind to know. If reality wasn't stable, if objects and things simply popped in and out of existence, right, there would be no reality to know, right? So stable reality is what allows us to actually know things and have truth, true knowledge. All right, then we have the lower realm in the allegory. And this represents the realm of conventional belief, right? Common sense belief. It's also, though, it's the world that the prisoners inhabit. And so it represents then the conventional world that we, human beings, inhabit. And then on the other hand, you have the upper realm. And this represents the realm of critical thinking, active intellectual investigation, right? What the prisoner is doing when he's outside of the cave. And so the upper realm, right, it's the illuminated world, and it kind of represents this idea of philosophical consciousness, right, that we discussed in the first section of class. And then, of course, you have the process of ascending, right, from the cave into the upper world. And this represents the process of actively engaging in this journey, right, critically examining our beliefs, intellectual growth. Now, the cave-dwelling prisoners, they symbolize just normal human beings. So to understand why every kind of human being is symbolized by the cave dwellers, we have to examine this idea of passively accepting or passively inheriting beliefs. And so consider this question and really think about it. How did your current political and religious beliefs first develop? Right? I mean, did your parents predispose you to believe certain things when it comes to political questions, like the correctness of conservative versus liberal views of the world? Did your parents predispose you to believe certain things about religion, like which religion ought you believe is the true one, if any at all? All right, did your parents predispose you to take up certain beliefs when it comes to kind of like economic questions? You know, should we increase the minimum wage? Should we keep drilling for oil and gas in U.S. soil? Should we eliminate the power of billionaires, or should we lower their tax rates? Did your parents predispose you to believe things about race and racism, about Black Lives Matter and the topic of teaching about the history of racism in school? And what about gender, right? Which gender or whether gender and sexuality is natural or socially constructed or somehow a mix of both, right? Morals and ethics, what kind of things count as socially acceptable and unacceptable behavior? And, just any other controversial topic, right? Such as abortion or, legalizing drug use or going to war as a country, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, well, yeah, of course, your parents predisposed you to believe certain things about all of those topics, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that your beliefs are wrong, but we need to take a step back and reflect on these two questions. One, is it difficult for you to justify your core beliefs when pressed by other people who think differently? And two, you have to ask yourself, right, how active are you in examining your beliefs and the reasons you have for holding those beliefs? And if the answer is, well, I'm not really active at all, then those beliefs are passively accepted. And when our beliefs are merely passively accepted, we find that we struggle to defend those beliefs when they're challenged by thoughtful people who think differently. Now, passively accepting or passively inheriting beliefs is perfectly normal. It's just not possible to grow up without some political and, religious predispositions. We're not blank slates who turn 18 one day and then decide to become political, right? As though we were saying all right, I'm going to read everything I can about the world, evaluate the merit of all the possible perspectives, and then deliberately choose all my important beliefs, and then build my identity up from scratch. Right? That's just not how human psychological development works. Instead, we grow out of existing cultures which have already indoctrinated us into a whole world of beliefs, worldviews, and perspectives. And so when I say indoctrinate, right, it's not that we're told what to believe by mom and dad or media and friends. I mean, sometimes we are, but rather what's going on is that we sort of unconsciously drink up beliefs and attitudes, accepting many of them as common sense and natural and obvious truths. But the problem here is that these passively accepted core beliefs shape our identities before we critically evaluate or examine them. And so it becomes disturbing when we encounter arguments are perspectives that challenge our identity-forming beliefs. And we have to struggle not to close our minds when those core beliefs are challenged, right? Because the impulse is for us to want to protect our beliefs because we want to safeguard our very identity, which is wound up in those core beliefs. But because of this, our mind is held hostage by those core beliefs. And this is the primary obstacle to personal and intellectual growth. And Plato wants us to understand that intellectual growth is a type of liberation, right? A liberation from this hostage situation. And so closing our minds in order to protect our beliefs and thus our identities, that's what keeps us locked into a mental prison. This is why intellectual growth and authentic education feels like liberating, right? It's like you discover a whole new reality wanting to be explored. And if you've never felt this type of intellectual, joyous liberation, it's because you've never actually experienced the power of education, even if you've been in school for the past 12 years of your life. Okay, now the allegory not only symbolizes for us a mental imprisonment, but the allegory presents the world itself as a sort of prison, right? The cave world is our shared reality. It's the world on offer that was here in advance of us. It's the world that we were born into. It's the world that we have to sell away our labor in. It's the world that we go to school in. It's the world that we go to church in and pay our taxes in and vote in. It's the world that we raise our children in. This is all the cave for Plato. And so the point is that this shared world is also passively inherited and accepted, just as many of our core beliefs are passively accepted and inherited. Right? Our most basic social arrangements, they get reproduced, often thoughtlessly, from one generation to the next, just like basic ideas and beliefs get passively reproduced from one generation to the next, right? But the point is, right, it may not be a good world with good, valid, and intelligent arrangements. It may simply be a world whose most basic arrangements have been taken for granted as good, valid, natural, and necessary, and then reproduced for the next generation. I mean, this was obviously the state of things under the unjust and unjustifiable economic arrangement of medieval feudalism and serfdom. I mean, think about it for a moment. For centuries and centuries and centuries of civilized human society, the most basic economic and political arrangements of medieval Europe were built on the brutal and systematic exploitation and abuse of the masses of people. But the point is this, right? Even if a particular king was despised as a tyrant, the basic arrangement of monarchism and theocracy were taken for granted as normal, natural, and necessary by both the highest noble and the lowliest peasant, right? And so to restate Plato's point, right? Not only is the prison a mental one, but we are prisoners of a passively accepted, thoughtlessly reproduced society, a world that you found yourself in, but it's definitely not a world of your own making. And so if Plato is right, then education is what allows us to understand ourselves as prisoners who have become conscious of this hostage situation. Okay, what about these people? Because Plato never really tells us explicitly who they represent. But who or whatever they symbolize, they are definitely in a position of extraordinary power. These passers-by who he says function kind of like puppeteers. Right? They're in a position of extraordinary power because whatever they hold up is what shapes the opinions and desires of everybody else. So we can think, right, who or what might they symbolize in contemporary society? Is the state, or let's say government, is that a puppeteer in the cave that we all live in? I mean, think about this question. Why do children in grade school not adults, but why do children who have no knowledge of the United States or its history pledge allegiance to it before they even know what the word allegiance means? Allegiance, of course, meaning a social relationship of both loyalty and obedience. I mean, is it delusional to imagine that we could organize functional human societies without governments at all, or without states? And we say, well, that's delusional. That would be impossible. It would be chaos and anarchy and so on. Well, the more we think about it, 500 years ago, almost every single human being living in Europe believed it was delusional to imagine that functional human societies could be organized without the absolute power of a pope and a king. Democracy to them was considered an insane proposal, identical with anarchy. Right? Society would devolve into total chaos and warfare without the authority of the church and the king, they all said. Now we recognize that this common sense belief, which was held by millions of people, held those people hostage to a miserable form of economic and political life, right? Again, feudalism and theocratic monarchism. I mean, consider also thinking about the state as a possible puppeteer, right? Does the state make use of certain myths that distort our perception of reality or history? Consider the idea, the myth, of manifest destiny. This was a widely held belief in the 19th century that the United States was destined to expand westward across North America, right, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And Americans at the time, they were told that it was their destiny to do this because of the special virtues of the American people, as opposed to the kind of savages that were already living in all this territory. And this state-sponsored myth of manifest destiny was used to justify the assimilation and the genocide of indigenous people. The myth of manifest destiny was also used by President Polk to justify an imperial war against Mexico and seize the sovereign territory, which later became the American Southwest. What about politicians? Are politicians, puppeteers in the cave? They can change our lives with the stroke of a pen. Political parties wield extraordinary power over what ideals get accepted as politically legitimate. Thus, politicians, they shape what we believe is politically possible and politically impossible. They sort of put up borders around our political imaginations. Do politicians try to convince us that it is primarily through them, in other words, through voting, that the world gets changed? But, we can, again, ask this sort of question we asked earlier in the semester, right? Was it voting? Was it relying on politicians that primarily changed our world for the better in the past? Did women vote for the right to vote? Did Black Americans vote for the right to vote? Right? It wasn't through voting that segregation was formally ended in the United States. It wasn't through voting for politicians that Americans ended child factory labor and won an 8-hour workday. What about corporations? Are corporations puppeteers in the cave? Corporations funnel millions upon millions of dollars into our public elections. So why? Why do they do that? Why do they finance the campaigns of nearly every major politician, both Republican and Democrat? What they're doing is effectively purchasing the loyalties of almost every politician. Lobbyists for these corporations write the laws that get passed by these politicians. And so clearly corporations have extraordinary power over the political policies and the ideals and beliefs that justify those political policies that are offered up for our passive acceptance. They have the most power of any particular group in the country. And of course, media, right? This is always usually the very first kind of example that we think of, how forces of media are puppeteering forces for our world, right? Consider conservative media, liberal media, the narratives and the talking points that are offered up by the 24-hour news channels tend to be what actually shape the political views of the masses of people in this country. It's not time spent reading and researching history, philosophy, political theory. It's the talking points you hear from Tucker Carlson or Rachel Maddow or Jake Tapper or Sean Hannity. Right? And what's fascinating is that your typical liberal and your typical conservative are both equally convinced that, oh, it's those other people that are brainwashed by the media. Right? So many typical conservatives believe liberals just think whatever the liberal media tells them to think. They just want free handouts. They're offended by everything. They are brainwashed sheeple. Meanwhile, right, a typical liberal dismisses conservatives as the most uneducated demographic in the country. Oh, they vote against their own economic interests. They're racist. They're sexists. They're brainwashed sheeple, right? Both conservatives and Republicans en masse believe it's the other group that's all brainwashed sheeple. What about parents? Parents obviously are puppeteering forces, but yet at the same time being kind of like stuck in the cave themselves. But parents obviously shape the beliefs and worldviews of their children regarding, as we mentioned earlier, political truths, religious truth, acceptable views on important topics ranging from homosexuality to gender expression to abortion to racism. Our parents shape our views as much as any other particular force in society, if not more so. What about teachers, though? I mean, most of my high school teachers were idiots, and many of yours probably were too. I mean, did schooling shape many of our beliefs, but yet at the same time fail to encourage or inspire an actual desire for intellectual growth, self-examination, and critical thinking? Religious leaders, right? They certainly shape the opinions and beliefs of their flock, as it were, but also advertisements, right? Which are generally the products of corporations, but we can consider advertisements themselves as having a sort of puppeteering force. Advertisements certainly shape our definition of, what gets counted as beautiful and desirable and normal. Yet, one look at the advertisements 40 years ago shows us quite clearly that the definitions of beauty have changed dramatically over the decades. And so whose imaginations were responsible for the redefining of beauty, right? Was it corporate advertisers or was it just everyday men and women themselves? So the puppeteers, they represent very powerful political and social forces in the world, right, in the cave. And for Plato, the puppeteers are maintaining this perverse condition of social and political ignorance. All right, so that's it for lecture 2. I'll hopefully have another video lecture posted soon, but the lecture notes are already up on D2L.